Many thanks for joining our virtual meetings at a time of pandemic as they continue. The instructions about how to make a comment or ask a question are on the email that I sent you today, or that was sent to you today. So our speakers will speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll do questions and discussion, finish no later than the top of the hour. And we're very grateful to have two of Australia's most significant economic commentators on the call today. We're going to start off with Judith Sloan. Both of them are well known to you, so I'll be very brief. Judith Sloan is contributing editor to the contributing economics editor to the Australian. Her background is as an academic, a public servant, a company director, and so on. Saul Eslake is an independent economist who appears regularly in the media, an occasional columnist, formerly chief economist with Bank of America, and also for a long time chief economist of the ANZ Bank. So we'll lead off with Judith. The topic being Australia's immigration intake, plus or minus. We'll lead off with Judith. We'll go to Saul. We'll go to questions and discussion. Judith, many thanks.
Thanks very much, Gerard and Anne, for inviting me. So I think it's quite important at the start to make two qualifying points. I think when you talk about immigration, you have to also talk about population policy. So I think we need to think of not just immigration, but what it is in the context of population policy. The other point is that we're not making judgments about the migrants themselves. We're actually making a judgment about the migration policy. So I think that's very important, because I think we can get very caught up in what might be regarded as a sort of judgment about the migrants themselves. The migrants, I think, by and large, are doing exactly as what you'd expect them to do, which is they're generally, overwhelmingly coming here to make a better life for themselves and their families. So I think that's absolutely fine. So I think it's really important to concentrate our critique, so to speak, on the migration policy settings of the government. I mean, having said that, the government should be acting in the best interest of Australian citizens and permanent residents. They don't, at a point in time, I think, have any wider moral obligations to people overseas, with the exception of course, the humanitarian program. But I would regard the humanitarian program, and I know, Gerard, you're very interested in this, but I think analytically it's very important to put that to one side. And there may be some questions about that. I'm happy to deal with that. But I think those two important preface remarks should be kept in mind. I think the thing is, you've got to think about this in two parts. The first is what I'd call the theory, and the second part is what I'd call the practice, right? So what's the theory about the impact of immigration? So there's a kind of micro side to it. So if you bring in a lot of migrants of a particular skill, those who are here domestically lose out. So if you have competitive skills with the migrants, there are losers, right? For capital, so the owners of capital for businesses, by and large, immigration is a very good thing. And for those workers who have complementary skills, then migration can be a good thing. So I think it's important to think about, it can obviously affect particular labour markets. And I'm hoping Saul might get onto this, because I think we've got a really interesting natural experiment at the moment, because with the international borders being closed, we don't have the migrant inflows. So we can kind of pick up what it's doing to individual labour markets and wage pressures and the like. I think it's absolutely fascinating, to tell you the truth. And I think this is a terrific topic for you and Anne to have selected. So there's the microeconomics, but then there's what I'd call the macroeconomics, and that's where you need to bring into account the sort of total economy-wide effects of migration. And you know, obviously migrants not just increase the supply of workers and increase the population size, they obviously also bring in demand, right? So what, not me so much because I'm not a macroeconomist, but what the macroeconomists can do often with their fancy models is model the impact of immigration at a macro level and figure out whether or not there are economic gains, what are the size of those economic gains, and what is the time frame of those economic gains. Now, one of the problems with migration, all other things being equal, is that it leads to some capital dilution. So you've got a fixed stock of capital, you bring in migrants, what happens is you've got less capital per worker. So in the short term, you may actually not have great economic benefits. It's only over time when the capital stock can be increased that you often get the effects. And that's by and large what the models say. The models say that over time, immigration can have positive net effects. Bear in mind that a lot of those gains are actually captured by the migrants themselves. And the size of the gains, and I'm quite happy to have a debate with Saul about this, but they look reasonably small to me. Because here's the important point. Obviously, immigration increases the absolute size of the economy. But what we are more interested in is what it does to per capita GDP. So unless the migrants actually look quite different from the locals, it's kind of going to be difficult for you to get a boost in per capita GDP. Now, one of the ways that's often said is that they're a bit younger than locals. They have higher participation. So those things can have a positive effect. Whether they have a productivity effect, I think it's a very open question. And one that I think the evidence is completely unsatisfactory on. And I don't like to go on too long because I think Q&A is always more interesting, but let me go on to the second part. So we kind of, I think, do vaguely understand the theory, although I think the empirical testing of that theory is a bit uncertain. But I think it's very important to look at the actual features of Australia's immigration program. Now, people will say to me that Australia was, Australia's economic development has always been based on immigration. Immigration must be a good thing. We need to continue immigration. Now, I'm not actually saying we don't need to continue immigration. But I think there are issues about the size of the intake. And secondly, there are questions about the composition of the intake, the composition of the program, the visas that allow in the migrants. Now, in the past, and really up until about the mid-1990s, we never had any temporary migrants. Okay, the people who came to Australia came here forever. And in many cases, take a lot of the migrants who came here after the war, quite a significant number never even went back to the countries from where they'd been born. So what happened in the mid-1990s is that we began a shift to much more temporary migration. So in that we had temporary workers, we had working holiday makers, and more latterly, the temporary migration has been absolutely dominated by international students. So pre-COVID, for example, there were 700,000 international students residing in Australia. And, depending on what they want to do, an international student with a graduation visa generally available for several years, they can stay upwards of 10 years. So that I think is a very important thing to bear in mind. We now have a program which, instead of it being dominated by permanent and indeed relatively skilled workers, we now have a program where there are permanents, but we also have a very large slew of temporary migrants. And by and large, with the exception of what actually is quite a small temporary worker program, some of you may remember the old 457s, most of those workers who come in on a temporary basis are actually not particularly skilled at all. And they have work rights, but they take jobs by and large in hospitality and retailing, which is, of course, why it's been difficult for those industries without the international students in particular. So what has happened, another important change in direction was not just the shift to temporary, was that in the sort of mid-2000s, there was a very significant kick up in the number of net migrants coming to the country. So up until that point, we had about 100,000 what we call net overseas migrants. So these are ones that come minus the ones who leave. So about 100,000. Since mid-2000s, and this is pre-COVID, the figure was closer to between 200 and 250,000. So we think about that. We've got about 150,000 through natural increase. We were getting migration basically contributing about 60% of population growth. And that, I think, is something worth debating. I think if we went out onto Pitt Street Mall or, well, you wouldn't want to go to Burke Street Mall because there's no one there, but and ask them, you know, what percentage of population growth should be made up of migration, I think many people wouldn't say, you know, nearly 2/3. So that has been a big change. And what it was meaning pre-COVID was that the population was increasing about 400,000 a year. So it was increasing by about the size of Canberra every year. And, but they were mainly going to Melbourne and Sydney. So, you know, being from Melbourne, I know about that. And also, I guess many people there from Sydney, you'd know about that too. So the kind of negative externalities that you might see associated with migration, which is, you know, congestion, pressure on infrastructure, pressure on roads, schools, transport and the like, it was being made worse by the fact that we had a migration program where it was really very difficult to direct them, and they naturally went to Melbourne and Sydney. So I think in terms of this debate, it's really important to think not just about, not theory, but, you know, have we got a good migration program? So another feature, I think, which is worth mentioning, which is our government, our current government, has introduced, and there have been versions of this, a business investment program. So essentially, if you've got not too much money, by the way, maybe $1 million, $1.5 million, that you can demonstrate that you're going to invest in Australia, you essentially can get a passport. And that it's not dependent on having English language skills. It's not dependent on being young. And so we've been allowing in about 15,000 of these business stroke investment migrants. And I think that's another serious critique of the government's migration policy setting. And interestingly enough, in a number of other countries like Canada, they got rid of these programs because basically they are not good value. And you're probably better to take a young, eager, recent graduate as a migrant who wants to do well than these. They're subject, I think, to enormous gaming, these business investment migrant programs. So look, I'll leave it there. I'll keep to my time, Gerard. But I think, you know, I really think this is a good area to debate, and we can debate it in a really sort of dignified way, because I think it does matter to a lot of people. And it's really important to get the policy settings right.
Many thanks, Judith. Saul.
Well, thank you, Gerard. Thank you, Gerard and Anne, in the first place for inviting me. I was surprised but delighted to have been invited. And I don't think I'm going to say anything that is in sharp disagreement with what Judith has said. Indeed, there are a couple of things I was going to say that I probably won't because she's already said them. But my point of departure was to note the, I think, underappreciated contribution that migration has made to some of the things that we boast about in terms of our economic performance. So I note over the 20 years to the final quarter of 2019, our economy grew at an average annual rate of 2.75%, which was almost a full percentage point above the OECD average. But during the same period, our population grew at more than double the OECD average, ours by 1.5%, the OECD's by 0.7% per annum. So if you strip that out, our overall economic growth rate was almost exactly the same. In fact, just 0.02 of a percentage point per annum below that for the OECD as a whole. If our population had grown at the same rate as the OECD average over the 20 years prior to the onset of COVID and everything else had been equal, instead of only having had 3 quarters of negative growth in that period and none of them in succession, we would have had at least 5, and we probably wouldn't have been able to say that we'd gone that length of time without a recession, for whatever that boast might have been worth. As Judith said, almost 60% of the increase in our population over the 20 years to the onset of COVID was directly attributable to net overseas migration. In other words, if it wasn't for the almost 4 million people who came to Australia as some kind of immigrant during that period, at least in excess of the number who left, our population growth would have been about the same as the average for all OECD countries. But again, I think I'm echoing Judith's position here in saying I'm not saying that Australia's immigration program has been a good thing because it's contributed so much to headline GDP growth, like Judith, and I think like almost all sensible economists, I don't advocate the pursuit of growth in GDP as an end in itself. Rather, I look to growth in per capita GDP as a measure of material living standards. And so, as Judith said, the more important question from this perspective, at least, is whether our immigration program has made a positive contribution to per capita GDP. And I refer to an investigation by the Productivity Commission that was published in 2016, which concluded that it did. It estimated that our migration intake at its long-term historical rate, with the same age and skills composition as what we've had over the last 20 years, would boost Australia's per capita GDP by about 7%. Or in today's dollars, that's about $8,000 per head by 2060. Now, of course, there are many aspects of both individual and societal well-being, things which both enhance and detract from sense that aren't comprehended by or included in GDP, whether you express it in per capita terms or not. And all of those things are relevant to any evaluation of the contribution that immigration makes to Australia's well-being and that of those who live here. Properly, the Productivity Commission went on to stress that whether migration delivers an overall benefit to the existing Australian community will depend on other factors, including the distribution of the economic benefits and what it called the broader impacts of immigration, notably the social and environmental impacts. But they nonetheless concluded that overall some positive rate of immigration within Australia's absorptive capacity is likely to deliver net benefits to the Australian community over the longer term. And that general conclusion was also evident in the most recent intergenerational report, which included modelling showing that, or at least suggesting that, our migration program not only contributed positively to per capita GDP growth, but also positively to the budget, because over the course of their lifetimes in Australia, migrants pay more in taxes than they absorb by way of government services. The intergenerational report, though, also noted that the economic and social pressures and capacity constraints that result from an inward flow of migrants need to be managed carefully, and that governments at all levels need to ensure that planning and infrastructure provision keep pace with current and future future migration rates. That's something which I would say governments at all levels haven't always succeeded in doing, and in some cases haven't even tried to do. It's worth emphasising, though, that these conclusions of the PC and the Treasury about the consequences of our migration program would be rather different if the composition of that program had been significantly different from what it actually has been. Evidence from overseas cross-country studies says that while the impact of immigration on average wages and employment of the native born, as these studies tend to call them, is either negligible or positive, it also shows that underneath these averages, the impact on different groups can vary significantly. That evidence suggests that selective immigration policies towards low-educated workers will tend to increase inequality between high and low-educated native workers, while policies in favour of higher educated immigration will tend to reduce it. Because of our geographic isolation from the most plausible sources of immigrants, we've been able, in John Howard's famous phrase, to determine who comes to Australia in the circumstances in which they do. Our immigration intake has been much more highly skewed towards people with knowledge and skills which more often than not have been acquired in their countries of origin at their own taxpayers' expense. And our program, because it brings to this country people who take on roles which, as Judith said, complement those performed by workers who are already here, rather than, in most cases, substituting for them, our program does appear to increase both the productivity of native-born workers and their wages. Those effects aren't as evident in the US or most European economies who, for reasons of geography perhaps, aren't able to be as selective about who comes to their country in the circumstances in which they do, as Australians have been. Now, in saying all of that, I'm not blanketly endorsing Australia's immigration program over the past 2 decades, or suggesting that when we do eventually reopen our international borders, we should simply restore the status quo ante in terms either of the number of migrants or the precise composition of our intake. I think the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Philip Lowe, made an important contribution to how to think about this in the speech he gave to the Queensland branch of the Economic Society last month. That speech, I think, has been wrongly construed by some as a call for a significant reduction in Australia's migration intake in the post-pandemic world in order to boost wages growth. I don't think that's what he was saying at all. Rather, in my view, he was calling attention to the fact that our immigration program might not have been as skills-based as is widely believed. He pointed out, for example, that a surprisingly large proportion of the 430,000 people who were in Australia on temporary visas at the time of the 2016 census were employed in unskilled jobs, including accounting for about 18% of all the jobs in the food trades, 13% of all the jobs in hospitality and in cleaning and laundry, 12% of all food preparation jobs, and 9% of factory process jobs and 8% of farm jobs. Dr. Lowe made 2 points about these numbers. First, that they've probably contributed to, as he put it, wages being less sensitive to shifts in demand than was once the case. And second, that the ability to draw on temporary migrants in these instances can dilute the incentive for businesses to train workers to do the required job. I think he's probably right on both of those counts. And so there's a case for rethinking whether we should be issuing as many temporary immigrant visas when our borders reopen as we have been doing before. And like Judith, I think there are some other elements to our migration program which warrant a rethink, in particular, the Business Innovation and Investment Program and the Global Talent Program, I don't think have made much of a contribution to improving the welfare of Australians or the Australian economy at all. But in the meantime, and here I'm going to take up, I think, something that Judith said she hoped I would, the closure of Australia's international borders in both directions, not just to migrants, but to tourists and students, although not, it would seem, to sports people, celebrities, Kardashians and cabinet ministers, is having some other underappreciated economic consequences. First, it's resulting in a more rapid decline in the measured unemployment rate than anyone had anticipated. What I mean by that is that over the decade prior to the onset of the pandemic, our working age population increased by an average of 26,000 a month, which meant that, abstracting from changes in the participation rate, the economy needed to create 16,500 new jobs a month on average in order to get the unemployment rate to fall. As it happened, the economy created almost exactly 16,500 new jobs a month between the December quarter of 2009 and the December quarter of 2019. So that although the unemployment rate fluctuated a lot from month to month over the course of that decade, essentially ended where it began, at about 5.25%. Since the closure of our international borders in March last year, the working age population's grown at an average of 4,300 a month, which means, all else being equal, we only need to create about 3,000 new jobs a month in order that the unemployment rate falls. Of course, in the first few months of that period, we lost and then recreated vastly more jobs a month than that. But so far this calendar year, the civilian working age population's grown by an average of 6,000 a month, meaning that the hurdle rate of net new job creation to get the unemployment rate to fall, given that the participation rate's been essentially unchanged over that period, has been just under 4,000 a month. Whereas in practice, in fact, we've created an average of 47,500 new jobs a month over the first half of 2021, which is why the unemployment rate's come down from 6.6 in December last year to 4.9, the lowest since 2010 in June. If the working age population were to continue growing at this rate until June next year, when the most recent budget assumed our borders would be reopened, and employment continued to grow at the same rate it has done over the first half of this year, then, by all else being equal, the unemployment rate in June next year would be 1.1%. That's pretty unlikely, of course, given the lockdowns which have occurred since June and which are now in place, although the labour market effects of those are more likely to show up as increased underemployment, an increase in the number of people working 0 hours but still counted as employed, and a reduction in total hours worked than as an increase in the official unemployment rate. But suppose the economy were to generate new jobs over the next 12 months at half the rate it has over the past 6, then the unemployment rate would still, all else being equal, be 3.2% next year. Maybe that's unrealistic too. But it surely isn't beyond the bounds of possibility that the economy could create new jobs at a quarter of the rate we've done over the last 6 months, that is by just under 12,000 a month. And if it did, the unemployment rate in June next year would be 4.2%, which is well into the territory that the Reserve Bank thinks is consistent with the idea of full employment, and lower than where the Treasury now thinks the non-inflation accelerating rate of unemployment, or NERU, is. Now, you might well ask, of course, in the absence of immigrants, where is the demand that will help create those new jobs going to come from? And the answer is in the second underappreciated corollary of the closure of our borders. Everyone knows, I think, that the closure of our borders to incoming tourists and students has had a significant adverse impact on our tourism sector and our higher education sector. Spending in Australia by foreign visitors to Australia dropped from 66 billion in the 12 months to March 2020, just before the drawbridge was pulled up, to $30 billion in the 12 months to March this year. There apparently being enough foreign students, tourists, and others who chose to or were allowed to remain in Australia to have spent 30 billion in that period. What's less widely comprehended is the taboo on Australians travelling overseas, unless, as I say, they're sports people, celebrities, or cabinet ministers. In the 12 months to March 2020, Australians spent $56 billion overseas. That number dropped to just over $1 billion in the 12 months to March 2021. Now, that $55 billion hasn't disappeared into the ether. Instead, it's been spent within the domestic economy, for example, on electrical and electronic goods, sales of which were 19% higher in the 12 months to March this year than they were in the previous 12 months. It's been spent on furniture, floor coverings, and the like, sales of which were up 20% over this period. It's been spent on hardware, building, and garden supplies, sales by whom were 22% higher in the 12 months to March this year than they had been in the previous 12 months. It wouldn't be Australia if we hadn't spent more on booze, sales of which were up 26% in the 12 months to March this year compared with the previous 12 months. We spent more on clothing and footwear in the 6 months to March, the previous 6 months having been more affected by lockdowns than other areas of sales. Sales of cars were 10% higher in the 6 months ended March this year than they had been in the same period a year earlier. Assuming, it seems plausible, that Australians have spent at home in the aforementioned ways or others, such as holidaying at home, all that they would have spent overseas if they'd been allowed to, this amounts to a bigger stimulus to domestic spending, $55 billion, bigger stimulus to domestic spending than anything that the federal government's provided through its budget, apart from JobKeeper. And that's a big part of where the demand that has helped to sustain more than enough job creation to keep the unemployment rate on an accelerated downward trajectory has been coming from. And it seems set to continue until whenever it is that Australian borders do reopen. That almost sounds too good to be true. And in at least one respect, it is. There's more than a whiff of protectionism about all of this to me. Remember that for the best part of 90 years, Australian governments of all political persuasions and the overwhelming majority of the Australian people, it has to be said, thought it was a good idea to force Australians to spend money which they would have preferred to spend on foreign-made goods, instead on goods produced in Australia, even though those Australian-made goods were almost always more expensive and usually of inferior quality to those made elsewhere, in order, so it was said, to create jobs in Australia, and in particular to create jobs in manufacturing, it being widely believed that manufacturing jobs were in some way inherently more worthy than jobs in other sectors of the economy. And indeed, for a time, those policies did result in Australia having a larger manufacturing sector than we would have had otherwise. But as we eventually came to understand, although it did take us almost 90 years to get there, it also contributed to Australia's long slide down the ladder of nations ranked by relative standards of living, from, as best as we can tell, near the top at the time of federation, to about 26th in the early 1990s. But after we came to our collective senses and started tearing down our tariff and quota walls, we climbed back to being about 12th in terms of per capita GDP, although of course there were other factors involved in that as well. Now we once again find ourselves forcing Australians to spend at home money they would have preferred, if they could, to have spent somewhere else. And that, at least for the time being, is helping to create jobs for Australians who, for the time being, don't have to compete for the jobs that are available with recently arrived migrants. I, however, fervently hope that we don't become addicted once again to a new form of protectionism. A misguided obsession with what some like to call sovereignty has already led us into some bad policy choices in the last 15 months, not least of them the decision to put almost all of our vaccination eggs into one basket because we had the capacity to make that vaccine here. A consideration to which the Canadians in particular accorded scant regard, and as a result of which they're now in a much better position to contemplate a lockdown-free existence sooner than we are. Allowing the relatively free movement of people across our international borders in accordance with criteria that we have determined has served Australia well for a long time. There are, to be sure, some adjustments to the criteria we applied in the years before the onset of COVID that could sensibly be made. But we should avoid, I think, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Australia's economy and our society and nation have been greatly enriched by the contributions that successive generations of immigrants have made. That doesn't mean it wouldn't be sensible to ask whether all of the different components of our immigration program are making positive contributions to our overall well-being. Like Judith, I think there are some that don't. It's similarly counterproductive to pretend that there haven't been some costs associated with the size of our immigration intake, in particular on housing affordability and for other dimensions of the quality of life in our larger metropolitan areas. That should make us focus on whether there might be other things we can do to improve housing affordability, for example, or reduce traffic congestion, which of course there are, we just don't want to do them, but without having to forego the advantages that a well-structured immigration program can continue to deliver for us. Thanks for that, Gerard. Hand back to you.
Many thanks, Saul, and thanks also to Judith. So we've got till the top of the hour. So our speakers kept to their allocated time, which is good. Now, I'll just remind everyone, because there are a lot of people around tonight, to be brief with your comment or question. So we go off with Dimitri Bernstein. Dimitri.
Hi, Gerard. Thank you. I'm surprised that you let me gazump you for the first question. Thank you, Judith and Saul. The metric that you both referred to in assessing economic contribution of migrants and migration is GDP per capita. However, hasn't that metric been distorted by the extraordinary levels of fiscal and monetary stimulus over the last 10 odd years? Is it possible that the per capita contribution of immigration is actually worse than the analysis suggests?
Who wants to take
my answer?
So,
My answer to that, Gerard, would be that the contribution of fiscal stimulus to the economy hasn't been nearly as large over as long a period as you implied in the question. I mean, yes, absolutely, there's been enormous fiscal stimulus to the economy in the last 12 to 15 months, wouldn't argue that. Of course, we haven't had any migrants in that period, so the comparison doesn't really apply all that much. There was a considerable amount of fiscal stimulus, of course, in the GFC, with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps more than we needed, and we did have some significant migration then, although I think it was actually peeled back from a peak in 2007 for part of the global financial crisis. But ever since about 2012 through 2019, fiscal policy was being tightened. Both governments of both political persuasions were desperately trying to get the budget back into surplus. And the Reserve Bank felt it necessary from time to time to lean against the wind by easing monetary policy over the course of that period. So at least if you're talking about the past 10 years, I don't think it is true to say that judging the impact of immigration by what happened to per capita GDP is leading to misleading conclusions.
Well, just briefly, of course, per capita GDP was quite disappointing over that period, and that is one of the problems for the what I'd call the migration boosters. At a time when migration was extremely high, per capita GDP was extremely disappointing in terms of its performance, as indeed part and parcel was the productivity, very sluggish productivity growth. I guess another way of thinking about it, Dimitri, and in one way I'm kind of loath to say this, but you see, GDP is not really a very good measure of what I'd call community well-being. Now, community well-being is sort of a term that's been hijacked, but let's just think about it. What matters to people is a lot beyond GDP. So people do worry about congestion, urban amenities, social cohesion, environmental effects, and GDP doesn't pick that up. And those reports that Saul talked about, they kind of pay lip service to it. They say, oh, well, we don't take into account these other things. They could be important. But I'm not sure that's quite good enough. I think we are going to have to move to the point where we start to put numbers on those things, because I think there is a lot of unease. And it's all very well saying, oh, well, there are other policies that can deal with that. But if those other policies don't deal with that, from the point of view of the local population, they often see migration potentially as a negative rather than as a positive.
Both of you will recall that Barry Jones, who was a commentator briefly for some years, a Labor politician, was always talking about the need for a population policy. Is there any sense in that? Would it make any difference positively or negatively? I mean, is it possible to have such a policy?
Well, it's one of those things, a bit like well-being, that a population policy in the wrong hands can sound sort of rather frightening, can't it? China has a population policy, and it had its one-child policy. So. But having said that, I think it's really important that we think of what economists, it sounds like an old-fashioned idea, but one that might come back into fashion, is what we call the absorptive capacity of the economy in the country. So there was always a view that you could only increase the population by a certain amount, beyond which the pressures became too great. So, but, you know, it's an interesting point. I mean, I go to a monthly lunch with a whole lot of, well, mainly former captains of industry, and they're all very big on Australia having a population of 50 million or 50 million or 70 million. So I kind of, you know, squirm, but I think it's a debate worth having, but I think I probably would have that debate short of implementing a population policy.
So,
I think it's reasonable for a government to be thinking about the sort of questions that Judith was posing, including making judgments about what she called the absorptive capacity of the society and the land. I mean, I wouldn't pretend to be able to calibrate it myself, but I accept the idea that there is probably some physical constraint, environmental or resources constraint on the carrying capacity of Australia's territory. That may change over time with variations in technology and so forth, but there probably is at any particular point in time. And if that's right, then the government probably needs to have some idea in its head about the rate at which the population can grow. I would say, in addition, however, that it is no business of the government to seek to influence how many children people choose to have. You know, they should neither prevent people from having a given number of children, nor try to insist or encourage them to have a particular number of children. You know, Judith mentioned China's policy is having all sorts of unpleasant effects and requiring all sorts of coercive instruments in order to achieve it. You could say exactly the same thing of Ceausescu's policies in Romania, which were done with the opposite intention. And I think, in fact, the one-child policy in China was a reaction to Mao Zedong having pursued the opposite objective for a lot of time that he was in power. I just think, you know, the government shouldn't be concerning itself with how many people children have, but in between allowing people to have the number of children they want to have and thinking about the carrying capacity, for want of a better word, of the nation.
He's just frozen.
And needs to have control, can adjust it upwards or downwards in order to bring whatever choices the people make about how many children they have, carrying capacity of the nation.
Okay.
And if you want to call that a population policy, fine.
We just had a slight problem with you breaking up there. So we got most of what you said. Just at the end, there was a slight problem. So go to Anthony Carr. Anthony. Anthony Carr.
Yes, I'm here. Yes, Saul and others have raised, and Judith particularly, have raised a key issue, and that is the social impact. And before anybody gets any wrong ideas, I've personally assisted an Asian migrant to come to Australia some years ago. Basically, does an emphasis on multiculturalism discourage migrants from integrating with the rest of society and lead to our diversity becoming a weakness?
Saul, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I'd respond to it in the negative. No, I don't think it does. You know, I suppose directly brought two Asians into this country as well, namely my children. You know, as I understand, it's not an area I've studied closely, but my understanding of the intention, not always the result, but the intention of the policy of multiculturalism that, you know, dates back to the Whitlam and Fraser era, is that people who've come to this country from countries with different cultures and backgrounds and languages and belief systems and the like, you know, should be encouraged to maintain and celebrate and be proud of that, and to share it with the rest of the Australian community. And the rest of the Australian community should likewise be respectful and welcoming of those different backgrounds, traditions, cultures, and beliefs which people bring with them, and that the society as a whole, our society, is enriched as a result. It is not as I've ever understood it, a recipe for people walling themselves off into ethnic ghettos and not connecting with the people who are already here or others who come after them. Our migration program does put some emphasis. You could argue about whether there ought to be more or less on this, on capacity to speak English. And certainly, as I've understood policies of multiculturalism, they have included as part of it reaching out to migrant communities to encourage them to learn English. And I guess in both New South Wales and Victoria, we have seen evidence in the last 12 months of what happens when you don't do that in an intelligent way, and people from diverse backgrounds aren't able to understand or comprehend the health messages that they're supposed to abide by. But, you know, without endorsing everything that has been done or not done in the name of multiculturalism, I think the principles behind it are ones that have and should help to make migration be more effective a contributor to our economy and our national life than it would be without it.
You don't see any.
Hang on, no, we're not. No, we're not going back. Judith, do you want to make a comment on that?
Well, I do think that's just way too Pollyanna, Saul. I mean, there are 1 million people in Australia who do not speak English, and speaking English is absolutely critical. And the thing is that if you get a geographic concentration of certain ethnic groups, they have no incentive to speak English. The people they deal with in a business sense will often speak their own language. And it really is an issue, and it is an issue around the world. So I think, yes, there are lots of positives, but there are also lots of negatives. And I think when you get the geographic concentrations, they have groups that do not marry out of their groups, for example, you do sometimes get problems. And I think, you know, it's naive to think that, you know, we used to hear Malcolm Turnbull say, we are the most successful multicultural country in the world. How did he know that? He just said that, right? And I think it's actually better if we confront some of this problem. Here's another issue. If you allow unskilled workers into this country, the locals will vacate, okay? We used to have locals doing farm work. We don't have locals doing farm work. So the research is very clear on that. So, you know, we might embrace our migration program, but at the margin, there are some really serious weaknesses. And so now we're having to bring in workers from Samoa to undertake farm work because the locals simply won't do it. So I just think it's better to be more realistic about both the costs as well as the benefits.
Okay, so we go to Janetta, and then we go to John. Janetta?
Hi, thanks very much. I've always been passionate about rural and regional, and having said that, I've always thought that maybe there should be a weighted GDP figure that comes out where you work on Maslow's hierarchy and you think about, yeah, sure, defence, security, but then you're looking at food and water because everybody else is really going to have to eat and drink in the economy. And having said that, do either of you believe that it'll have a huge effect on Australia when the inland rail from Melbourne to Brisbane via Parkes, which will have the 8 new cities along, it's like the Chicagos of the inland, will be able to attract industry because they've got quick route to market and be able to actually balance out some of the issues that have come from having less tourists?
Okay, so anyone want to jump on that train? Inland rail, good, bad, doesn't matter.
Well, Judith may have a different view, although I'd rather hope not, that the inland rail was designed to pick up votes, not freight. And
People.
The fact that the government was never willing to expose to public scrutiny the business case for it, I think ought to make people highly suspicious of the reasons why it was put there. You know, I am profoundly skeptical of the value, and you know, I say this as someone who lives in what's usually regarded these days as rural and regional Australia. I am profoundly skeptical of that particular project and a number of others like it, the Alice Springs to Darwin Railway being one that readily comes to mind. These are in effect examples of governments making decisions where they do attach a greater weight to one group of people's dollars than to those of others.
What train are you on?
I mean, I think the regional migration issue is really an interesting question in itself. And the government has attempted to have sub-programs where people are encouraged to go to the regions. Of course, you can't build rabbit fences, and so sometimes they come to the regions and then leave. There obviously have been some really big success stories. So there's a little town in Victoria called Nil, where the Karen people have come from Cambodia, I think, or Laos maybe, and that's been a great success.
Burma.
Oh, from Burma. But then by the same token, Shepparton, where a lot of migrants have gone, has not been a success. But if you think historically about the Snowy Mountain scheme, you think about Mildura, for example, there were a large number of migrants that went to Mildura and have stayed there. So there have been some really, I think, quite uplifting examples of migrants going to the regions. And it's an interesting point. I think many regional areas will say, yes, come, we need people, we need critical mass. So it's a hard nut to crack, I think, to get people to go to regions and stay there.
We're getting close to the end, so I've got to be brief. John Doherty.
Thank you, Gerard. Judith and Saul, a question on education. We've imported a large number of highly skilled people. We have children who are produced by those people. Why has there been no material effect on the standard of education as recorded in NAPLAN, etc., as a result of improved competition at the school, primary, and even university level?
Judith, you've been an educator, I haven't. Why don't you answer that first?
Well, is there any relationship between education and immigration? Standards of education in Australia and immigration?
Well, the Asians have done well.
I think, I think the reasons we've had falling education standards are multifactorial, as we'd say. And I do think in classrooms where there are children with, different languages, that must probably affect the rate of progression of students on average in those classrooms. So, it's an interesting issue. Saul will probably nod when I say this, but, Australia's been by and large very lucky in the sense that we have had a relative concentration of migrants in recent times from China and India. And both those nations or both those cultures value education very highly. And if you look at the top students in Year 12, for example, you'll find a disproportionate number of those with the Chinese and Indian background. So in that sense, I think we've been very lucky. Not all cultures around the world do value education highly, particularly for girls. Wow. And so in that sense, I wouldn't go blaming the migration program for falling education standards. I think you need to look elsewhere.
I think we're virtually running out of time. Jeff, if you're quick. Jeff Hodgson.
Thank you, Gerard. My question relates to the opportunity, I guess. Why can't we get the government to actually, and Treasury, to actually review this immigration program? It seems to me that, as David Attenborough highlights, population is driving the environment, climate change, and probably a factor in the pandemic itself. It just seems and the points that the speakers have made about the opportunity to see what happens when we don't have high immigration. why can't we get them to have a proper review?
Well, I mean, if a government of the day wanted one, it would be done. Treasury doesn't usually go off on inquiries of that nature of its own accord in pursuit of some kind of intellectual truth. And I don't think even the Productivity Commission is allowed. Judith would know, she's been on the Productivity Commission. I think they would need to have a reference from the government in order to pursue a line of inquiry like that. And if a government wanted that to be investigated, it would be investigated. If they don't want it to be investigated, it won't be, at least not by a government agency.
I mean, Treasury does have now this population centre which puts out stuff. I think the trouble for Treasury is that it tends to focus on what I'd call the fiscal boost or the fiscal drain. So they like migrants who, as Saul said, pay more taxes than they take out in terms of expenditure. They disregard the costs that are foisted on the states, I might add, in that calculation. So it's a little self-serving. But look, I would
That's why they disregard it, yeah.
The Treasury, I mean, the Productivity Commission can do its own research, but on a sort of very broad-based project like that would look, I think, a little controversial. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's just, people like me and some other commentators will continue to sort of bark away, maybe howl at the moon, some would say. And I think there will be a debate about it. And I mean, tonight is a very good example that there is quite a lot of interest in this. And, it's always a case of, benefits and costs. And, let's kind of start to identify them and add them up.
Brian Holster, to be very quick, we can fit you in. Brian? Can't hear you. Can't hear you. So look, we'll just conclude.
A lot of lobbyists from industries and from universities to increase the numbers. How can people support you, Judith, in putting the other arguments?
Yeah, well, look, you're absolutely right.
I just interrupt here for a second. So the suggestion seems to be that Judith wants to reduce immigration, and the suggestion seems to be that Saul probably wants to increase education. So that's a good way for immigration. So that's a good way for us to win. So Judith, you answer the question and we'll end with Saul.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I call the net overseas migration, we should be bringing that back. It shouldn't be 230,000. It should be, 100,000. And I really want us to look at every individual component of the program, every visa, because some deliver net benefits and some clearly don't. And therefore, you're right. But I think Brian has a really important point, that if you're trying to understand migration policy, the government is pressured by those, what I'd call rent seekers, who really don't care about the national interest. They want workers, they want customers. And that's really, if you want to understand what's happened, that really is the explanation.
Final comment, Saul?
Yeah, I was miscaricatured if people think that I'm advocating an increase in the immigration program. I'm not. And to be quite specific, I think the business investment program and the global talent program should be wound back very substantially, if not abolished altogether. And I think there should be a significant reduction in the unskilled component of our migration program, which has been allowed to creep up quite significantly over the last 5 years. I suspect the Chinese government is going, whether we want to or not, to reduce the number of Chinese students in particular who come here when our borders are reopened, and we'll have trouble replacing them with students from other places if we want to retain the overall quality of it. I completely agree with Judith that we should look through the rent seeking by certain industries, and immigration wouldn't be the only area where the property development industry in particular seeks to have its own pursuit of rent foisted on the cost of that, foisted onto other people. They do that in a whole lot of areas to do with housing policy that exacerbate the impact that rapid population growth has on housing affordability. And I'd be as eager to call that out as Judith has been to call out their rent seeking in terms of wanting to boost the rate of population growth. So that's my comment, Gerard, is that I'm not advocating a bigger migration program. I'm advocating some significant changes to the composition of it, which would probably result in a smaller migration program than we've had, although I'm not at all persuaded that we needed to reduce the overall amount by 50%, as Judith suggested.
Okay, well, the Institute is all about debate and discussion, and we've had terrific debate and discussion tonight on a range of views with people taking different positions, including our speakers and our contributors. So thanks to all of you, but special thanks to Judith Sloan and to Saul Eslake. They're some of Australia's best known and most respected commentators, and we're very pleased, Anne and I and the Institute, that you gave your time tonight to talk to us. So many thanks, and we'd love to have you back again sometime in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.